Hello readers, welcome back to PJL Books and welcome to today's Off the Shelf. Today's Off the Shelf topic is going to be Antagonists, Part 1, The Three Forces. Now we all know that one of the most important components of an engaging story is having a quality antagonist. In fact, many of the finest pieces of fiction out there have a villain that is just as famous as the protagonist, yeah? Characters such as Hannibal Lecter, Voldemort, Darth Vader. These characters are as much of the DNA of their stories as the good guys, if not more so. But what separates the believable, complex villains from the cardboard cutout baddies? Over the next few weeks on Off the Shelf, we're going to be going over some of the dark side of the story, looking at what goes into an impactful and believable antagonist. Starting with Part 1, today's topic, the three antagonistic forces. Let's start at the very beginning then. So what is an antagonist anyway? What does it mean? Well, it comes from the Greek word antagonizes tai, which means struggle against. And that's interesting, because when we look at the majority of definitions for an antagonist, it's phrases like a person who actively opposes or is hostile to someone or something, an adversary. Now, can you see something that's been lost in translation between the Greek meaning and the modern English definition? Well, actually, when I say lost, I mean added. The English definition, you see, assumes that the antagonist needs to be a person, but it doesn't have to be. In fact, I think the biochemistry sub-definition of antagonist is more accurate for our purposes here. That is, an antagonist is a substance which interferes or inhibits the psychological action of another. Now this is what we mean when we talk about antagonistic forces, because, as the Greeks said, an antagonist is anything that your protagonist would struggle against. It's the foil to your good guy succeeding in whatever they are trying to do. So now we have this wider scope, we begin to realize that your antagonist doesn't have to be another person. Now, forces like these can work against our heroes from any number of places. However, antagonistic forces break down into three broad categories: external forces, environmental forces, and internal forces. Now, external forces are your living, breathing bad guys, very real, very tangible villains of the piece with whom the protagonist can interact with and have a relationship with. The benefits of having an external villain are immediately clear, partly because it's the most widely used and recognizable antagonistic force we know. Interactions between our good guys and bad guys provide depth to both sides of the argument if done well, and can make our protagonists doubt themselves, feel as though overcoming their external antagonistic force is impossible, and they can see themselves reflected in the antagonist's actions and fear how close they are to becoming the same, which all makes their triumph much more satisfying when it happens. Now, that being said, external forces don't need to be person-shaped. Jaws is a perfect example of a non-human antagonist, as well as Aliens. This removes the layer of direct communication, making any attempts at reasoning and rationale nearly impossible. This provides a sense of futility and hopelessness to the protagonist's actions, and it works well in the horror or thriller genres. Environmental forces go one step further from animals because there is absolutely no discourse to be had with the environment. Now, these are things like disaster movies such as Twister, or apocalyptic movies like Armageddon or The Day After Tomorrow. There is no mercy, no rhyme, or reason to the environmental antagonistic forces. In most cases, the protagonist's motivation is to simply survive, or to at least take control of what he or she can take control of so that the damage is minimized. For example, Atreyu in The Neverending Story and his struggle against the Nothing. Now, in these cases, you will notice that many stories utilize a secondary villain of sorts, who will be a tangible external force that gives the audience a face to hate, if you will. In The Lord of the Rings, as Sauron is physically absent to the point that he can almost be considered an environmental antagonistic force, we have a number of these secondary foils that the protagonists can face off against, such as Gollum. And lastly, we have internal forces. Now this is the trickiest one to pull off, as it is by nature difficult to define and manifest on the page or screen. But when it's done well, it can be the most effective antagonistic force of all. Put simply, it is the protagonist's own personal antagonist, that nagging doubt that psychologically impedes them from succeeding. That's why I like the biochemistry definition of interfering with or inhibiting the psychological action of another, because it fits with the idea of this mental barrier, the internal antagonistic force within. In Spider-Man 2, who was the real villain? Dr. Octavius? No, I don't think so. He was definitely the secondary villain in that film. No, the real antagonistic force was actually Peter Parker's own self-doubt, his increasing belief that he was no longer worthy or wanting of the Spider-Man role. Frodo's journey to Mount Doom would have felt empty and meaningless if he had never doubted that he would have made it or had the strength to let go of the ring. Protagonists fighting their own personal demons can be extremely difficult to pull off, because you will need to have a flawed protagonist in the first place, a chink in the armour which will be exploited. Furthermore, showing the development of this inner conflict can be tricky, so that the development feels natural and smooth up until the crisis point, where the protagonist effectively has a showdown with themselves. But if you can put it off, this creates a dramatic tension that the other two types of antagonistic force cannot rival. Not that you're hemmed in by just one type, mind you. You can have one of each in your story. The Matrix, for example, has Agent Smith as an external force, yet he is arguably the face of the environmental force that is the Matrix itself. At the same time, you have Neo's self-doubt that he is the One. There's actually a lot of legroom and freedom for interpretation when you think about the different types of these antagonistic forces. As long as it serves as an obstacle to your protagonist that pushes them outside of their comfort zone and forces them to act in order to succeed rather than simply coast through the narrative, then that results in a satisfying and meaningful conflict. But more on that in part 2. And that's it for today's Off the Shelf. Thank you very much for listening, readers. This post will be on my website, the link of which is in the description below, and part 2 of this antagonist mini-series will be up next week. Thank you very much and see you next time. Bye bye.